Have you ever been in a conversation where you know that somebody is lying to you, but you don't know why they're lying to you? Well, people will lie for a variety of reasons. However, there's something that often doesn't take enough attention, and that is the cultural reasons why somebody might act one way or another. And that often stems from the motive and the motive a person might have, despite or whatever the truth might be. In this example, where somebody is lying to you, they're leaning on their primary motive. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Lying happens all the time. And in my book, I talk about the reasons why it matters so much to really get straight with our mindset and the way that we approach conversations. Otherwise, we might inadvertently be lying to the people that we love the most or the people that we work with every single day without even realizing it. In fact, even worse, we might be lying to them in an effort to preserve something that is secondary to what matters most. That is, we might be lying in order to protect the relationship, or in order to not make them look bad, or in order to make ourselves look better in the eyes of that person. So we're going to dive into that today. And after this video, my hope is that you will get a much better understanding around how you communicate with others and the reasons why others communicate with you in a manner that sometimes might come off as untrustworthy, or at least a little dubious. So let's dive into that. So we're going to start with our board, and this is going to be our small board today. And there's a lot of content on here, but don't worry, you don't have to memorize any of this. I'm going to tell you every one of these little things. And after you hear this video and after you understand these concepts, you're going to be 100 times more equipped to handle conversations. Now, the topic of today's video is courageous conversations. So these are typically conversations that have high stakes. It could be, for instance, a personal relationship. Think about that like in a family setting. You might have, just a conversation with your spouse or with your children or with your parents. It could also be a conversation that you have in a professional setting. And that's really where we want to focus most of the attention today, but by all means, take it wherever you want. In a professional setting, it's very common to have a courteous, respectful, values-backed, or virtuous conversation at work. Because ultimately we want the workplace to be a place where people feel comfortable to not only be themselves, but to also express themselves openly. However, the very nature of a professional workplace sometimes makes it difficult because you have to choose, and that's where the lying begins. Because at the end of the day, if you have to choose between two things that are in conflict with each other, you're going to pick one. And when you pick one, you're going to inadvertently, the other option that you did not select will be in contrast or in conflict with that other option. And that's why we have to get straight with the motives. Because if we can understand our motives and what the other person needs of us, then we're going to speak with the truth more often than not. And that means that we're going to be much more courageous at work, and that we're going to be more valuable at work, and that we're going to be more trustworthy at work. And those are all incredible values and virtues that we all want to get across. Now, by the way, nobody's perfect and everybody's made mistakes. And I read a statistic the other day that people will lie without even knowing every single day, which is kind of troubling in its own way. But we're not talking about necessarily the virtue or the value of lying versus telling the truth, but rather the importance of why telling the truth or why lying could come off differently. And yes, there are technically different ways of perceiving this depending on your religion, your upbringing, your faith, what matters to you. And that's really what we're going to dive in today. So two people could actually be speaking the truth, and yet one of them is in a way lying. And that's really what we want to get to the bottom of today. All right, so first and foremost, we need to start with this idea or this premise that the health of a relationship or a professional relationship is the time between when a problem arises and when it is addressed. So think about, if you have a spouse, a significant other, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, think about any argument that you might have had. I guarantee you that the majority of the discussion probably revolved over a topic that you might already have forgotten. But what really was at stake is the motives behind. So the object of the discussion really was the catalyst, or it was the spark, if you will. But it wasn't really the reason why you fought or why you had a disagreement. That really just became the catalyst. So what we want to get to in this video is that reason behind. So what is operating silently behind a discussion or a disagreement that ultimately led to the disagreement to begin with? Now, ultimately, if we think about this concept that we just expressed right now, the health of a relationship is the time it takes to identify a problem and resolve it. And look, I'm an engineer, and to me, this makes absolutely perfect sense because in our world, we are constantly solving problems. Now, that's not a bad thing. We are looking for ways to make things run a little smoother or for efficiency. So ultimately, the mind of an engineer is technically geared towards identifying problems that need to be resolved so that things can be better. Well, that's ultimately what I tell myself, even though sometimes I fail miserably at the task. But you get the point, right? So if you think about this in terms of a relationship or a professional relationship, then the time it takes to identify a problem and resolve it is really where that conflict usually comes in. The quicker we can address that, the better off we're going to be. That's why it takes courage, because if I identify a problem and I know a way to resolve it, but there's different motives operating in the background, then in all likelihood, I'm going to tiptoe around what I've already perceived to be the thing that needs to be said. And that's why it creates conflict. And the reason I'm doing that is because I am protecting a series of other truths. And this is why people say, speak your truth. It's not so much that there are multiple versions of truth. There are multiple motives. And that's what gets confused often as the truth, right? So ultimately, whatever you choose to use is fine. If you say, hey, this is my truth and that's her truth, go with it. But ultimately, think about it more from the perspective of motives. What are the motives that are operating silently behind that are informing your decisions? And yes, this goes all the way to your thoughts, the intimacy of your most personal thoughts. All of that will make its way into your conversations. In fact, in order to lean on that, we have a book here. It's called As a Man Thinketh by James Allen. James Allen is one of my favorite authors. He is a man who wrote a lot about how the mind works and about how the power of our thoughts will ultimately make our reality. I'm just going to read you a very short paragraph of one of his chapters, and it goes like this. A particular train of thought persisted in, be it good or bad, cannot fail to produce its results on the character and the circumstances. A man cannot directly choose his circumstances, but he can choose his thoughts. And in so doing, surely he shapes his circumstances. I'll read that again from the perspective of a woman. A particular train of thought persisted in, be it good or bad, cannot fail to produce its results on the character and circumstances. A woman cannot directly choose her circumstances, but she can choose her thoughts, and so indirectly, yet surely shape her circumstances. So in other words, what James Allen is telling us here is that what we think about ultimately makes its way into our circumstances, and what we say and what we think and how we operate. So there's incredible power in identifying what we're even thinking about. Because if we don't take the time to think about what we're thinking about, it's going to come out one way, shape, or form. And that is a fact, that's a law. That's why, by the way, when you talk with people who just kind of seem a little bit off kilter, it's because more often than not, what they're telling you is not consistent with what they're thinking. And therefore, there is an inconsistency in the way they're being expressed. And that expression, by the way, as people who really study the idea of bodily expressions, comes out somewhere in their shoulders, in the way their eye might be twitching, their smile might be just a little off somehow. Any one of those things is an immediate clue that what they're thinking is not consistent with what they're saying. And ultimately, that's how to spot a lie, by the way. Now, we're not detectives, we're not in the CIA, and we don't really care to necessarily mega analyze or super analyze or micro analyze the people that we're speaking to, unless that's kind of what you want to do. But for the most part, we don't necessarily want to identify the lie, but we want to be consistent in the way that we think and the way that we speak, so that more often than not, we run into circumstances where we get the opportunity to shine and to really just attract those people to us. Because the most trustworthy that we are and that we're perceived, while acknowledging that we're not perfect, then the better off we're going to be in terms of our personal relationships, our professional relationships, our friendships, everything. All right, so let's go back to our board here. Now, we talked about the health of a relationship is the time between identifying a problem and resolving it. So let's get to the bottom of how do we close that gap, or how do we identify what operates in that gray area where we've identified the issue and now we need to speak up about it. And to do that, I'm going to use a super easy example. And this is kind of a cute case, but it just goes to show how this is not necessarily something that is exclusive to adults. Children also do this without even realizing it. So I heard this story the other day. It was a boy that was like 8 or 9 years old, and he wanted to do an experiment at school. So he whipped up a batch of fresh brownies with his mom's help. And he made these brownies, and then his dad told him, why don't you make a second batch of brownies, but instead of sugar, put salt, put a bunch of salt in it. So they're gonna taste horrible, right? So there's, one batch of brownies that are absolutely delicious, and there's a second batch of brownies that instead of sugar, they have salt in them. So as you might imagine, they're horrible. But the whole point of this little experiment was this boy wanted to know if his friends would be willing to speak the truth, to tell him honestly that the brownies that he made, the ones with salt, were supposed to be a special recipe that had been passed down from his grandmother to his mother and now to him. So it was like a very special brownie, right? Now that was, of course, all made up, but that was why this experiment worked so well. So in this experiment, he gives his friends 2 different brownies. He says, try the first brownie, and the one that they tried first was the one that has the sugar, the normal delicious brownie, right? So everybody was like, oh my gosh, they're delicious. Now for the second brownie, he gave them the one with salt. Now, there's this little video, and the kids are like even squirming as they're eating this brownie that tastes probably horrible. And in addition to that, for doing this experiment, this kid gave each of his friends $1 as a way of saying, thank you for taking the time to sit with me and do this experiment. Now, after they had tasted both of those brownies, he asked each of his friends which one they liked better. Well, sure enough, every single one said that they liked the brownie with the salt better. So they actually lied to his friend. 8-year-old kids already understood the value of what was at stake, and they lied to his friend and told them that the brownie that they liked was the one that was packed with salt, the one that had that special recipe that he had inherited from his grandmother. So what happened there? And by the way, to know the truth, after the experiment was over, he went around and offered each of his little friends extra. He said, hey, there's more here if you guys want to take some more. Well, of course, nobody took any of that. So that's how he knew for sure that they were lying. So what happened in that little experiment? So this is point number 2, the dichotomy of choice. So in essence, this principle explains that we inherently believe that we have to make a choice, that we have to choose between 2 things or more. And in this case, the dichotomy of choice is choosing between truth and friendship. And that's why every single one of those kids lied about the brownies, because they thought that they had to make a choice between their friend and what was at stake, essentially this recipe that had been passed down, by generations, and the truth. And the truth was that they were absolutely horrid. And that would make perfect sense. Now, there's a different case that happened some time ago that I read about, and I thought it was an excellent point. But this was actually a very high stakes situation. During Ronald Reagan's presidency, he made a tour to Germany. And this was a normal diplomatic tour that he made to Germany with our German allies. And during that time, he visited a cemetery and paid tribute to American soldiers. But unbeknownst to him, this cemetery contained the tombs of former Nazi soldiers. Now, he was unaware of this. President Reagan did not know that there were Nazi soldiers that were buried at this cemetery. Now, at the time, and I can't think of his name right now, but the Prime Minister of Israel was a really good friend of President Ronald Reagan. When the media caught wind of the fact that President Reagan had visited a cemetery that included the tombs of former Nazi soldiers, they immediately went over to the Israeli Prime Minister and informed him of this event. And one of the interviewers that was very weaselly said, "Prime Minister, President Reagan just did this." And he wanted to just like catch him in a surprise and make him, create a big ruckus over this. And then the Prime Minister, when the Prime Minister of Israel learned of this news, he was obviously concerned, because this is obviously a reason to be concerned. But later, he expressed very eloquently why he didn't have to choose between this dichotomy. He said, "A friend remains a friend, and a mistake remains a mistake." I mean, how beautiful is that? Most people would have had to choose between, and that's really what this interviewer wanted to do. This reporter rather, he wanted to catch the Prime Minister in a moment where he would have to pick between the principles of the nation of Israel and between his friendship with President Reagan. And ultimately, the Prime Minister, in his wisdom, said, "I don't have to make a choice. I just have to call out exactly what it is." And he said, I know the character of Ronald Reagan. I know who he is as a man, and I understand perfectly that he would never do anything like that knowingly. In other words, if he had previous information, that would have helped him make a better decision. So ultimately, he says, a friend remains a friend, and a mistake remains a mistake. And in doing so, he completely destroyed this idea of the dichotomy of choice. That's a beautiful example in a very, very high stakes situation. Now, most of us, fortunately, probably will never have to deal with something quite of that magnitude, but we'll probably have to deal with things that are a little bit more serious than this 8-year-old kid and the brownies, right? So when we find ourselves in that middle of the road where we need to make decisions that are courageous in nature, the thing I want to leave you, if you take anything from this video, is you don't have to make a choice. That is an illusion. The illusion that you have to make a decision between the friendship, the relationship, and the truth. That is not true. You can acknowledge the truth and acknowledge the relationship. And in doing so, you actually remove the power of whatever this event is, and you bring it right back to you. Now, this is a lot easier said than done. I mean, imagine being in that moment, interviewed, caught cold, and thrown this piece of information that your brain and your amygdala and your lizard brain, if you will, your primal instinct will want to kick in. And I'm sure this is something that all of us have experienced anytime we've had some kind of a disagreement, where our animal instinct kicks in, and it's that protective mechanism that wants to say, "Oh my gosh, how could she do this to me? How could he do this to me? Why would he do such a thing?" Right? And in that moment, our instinct is to protect ourselves. And that's why we guard ourselves. That's why we retaliate. In fact, there is a quote, or more than a quote, it's a statement really, by Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor and went on to write an incredible book, which is Man's Search for Meaning. And he says, there is a space between an impulse and a reaction, or a situation and how we react to that. And in that pulse, in that space, which might be very small, resides our freedom and our ability to make a choice. So the best piece of advice you can take, if you take anything from Viktor Frankl, is pause. And that's exactly what this Israeli prime minister did, is he did not immediately react. He allowed himself a moment to move away from that very primal instinct and over to the more intellectual, analytical, calm space that tends to reside on the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of our brain, where logical, calm decisions are made rather than rash, instinctual impulses. And that's why it was such a beauty of an example in this notion of the dichotomy of choice. Okay, so we understand the motive. we understand that the motive is really what operates in the background, right? So this is one of the concepts that we explained earlier in the video. Let's dive into that now. So the motive that you cannot see is controlling you. So that's why when we've had instances where we acknowledge that maybe somebody is lying to us, it's because there is a motive, an unseen motive that is silently operating in the background. And that motive is informing all the decisions, all the words, all the choices that that person makes, to the extent that it can come off as untrustworthy or just false or as a lie. And that's why this matters so much. So let's talk about some of those motives, because in a different video, I explained some of the aspects between direct and indirect communication. And a super easy example might be if, let's just say that you're getting ready to go to a party and you look over to your spouse and I tell her, honey, how do you think this tie looks on me? And maybe it's a goofy looking tie. Maybe it's just a little too old school. I don't know. It's probably not a good fit, or maybe it's not a good color for me. But we're in a rush and she just really doesn't want to take any longer. So she might say, it's fine, babe. It's fine. Just go ahead and run with it. You'll look all right. So I'm going to this party thinking I'm looking fabulous with this tie, but even she recognizes that that's maybe not exactly the truth, but she said that in an effort to, and that's the motive. So why did she come out with an opinion that is opposite to the truth? We go back to this dichotomy because there's a motive, and that's the motive we want to explore. So I laid out a few motives here, but there are a plethora of motives. In this case, the main motive was we don't want to be late. So she's basically telling me, just let's go on, let's move it. Also, really nobody's going to be paying that much attention to you anyways. So maybe in that example, it's the idea of saving face, keeping the peace. So I'd like to go through some of these because these actually do happen every single day, whether at home or at work. But you get my point, right? In that moment, somebody was willing to sidestep the truth in order to prioritize a different motive, unbeknownst to me. So all the while, I'm operating in this party setting as if that was the best choice, well, at least according to the opinion of my spouse, when in reality, the reason why I'm even wearing that to begin with is because of a different motive altogether. So saving face is a really natural, common example as to why somebody might be willing to sidestep the truth or a fact because they're trying to save face. So it's the idea of it's this protection instinct, right? So in the example of the Israeli prime minister, the reporter who asked him the question was really looking to get at that motive, right? Because if you stand behind the importance of the freedom of life and of liberty, as would probably any prime minister, then the actions that President Ronald Reagan took were inconsistent by, in a way, honoring the tombs of former Nazi soldiers. Now, he obviously didn't know this, so this is unbeknownst to him, and that's why this is such a fundamental point here. Now, in that example, the reporter really wanted to catch the prime minister off guard. So the reporter thought, oh my gosh, he's gonna be outraged, and this is gonna make for a great story. We're gonna sell newspapers and ads and everything. So clearly that reporter probably had a bit of a not very virtuous approach towards all of this. But anyway, we won't judge the reporter. We really don't know all the details behind. But in that moment, rather than save face, what the prime minister did was he addressed the dichotomy. So that was a beautiful way of addressing it. Keeping the peace. So man, this is probably the most common example. And by the way, this is where culturally, it also pays to understand how different cultures approach conversations. So we've talked about direct and indirect conversations in the past. Direct communicators don't necessarily lead with the idea of keeping the peace. That's not the primary objective. That's because the relationship isn't the primary objective. Now, in the process of leading with direct communication, you may inadvertently disrupt the peace. Now, contrary to that, indirect communicators tend to lean a lot more on the relationship or the quality of the long-term relationship. Therefore, they are probably more apt or susceptible to being led by a motive that resides in the space of keeping the peace. In other words, these are people pleasers. And if you happen to be a people pleaser, then raise your hand, because this is super common, and it's actually super common in the US as well. This is not necessarily, focused on any one culture or ethnicity or country of origin. This happens all around the world, and people will attempt to keep the peace for a number of reasons. In fact, even in that silly example I gave just a minute ago about the tie, my spouse said, sure, the tie looks fine on you, because in a way she's trying to keep the peace. If she would have said, no, please go change your tie, not only would we probably be late, but then I might retort and say, wait a minute, you don't like my tie? What's wrong with my tie? I think it looks great on me, yada, yada, yada. So then we go into a whole conversation that she probably really doesn't want to get into in that moment. So she says, it's fine, it looks great on you, let's move on. The motive is keeping the peace. Now, how often does this happen at work, right? How often does this happen in your personal life? So really the idea that I want you to come back to is identify the motive, because you have to be able to call it out first. Now, in a situation like this, it's pretty trivial. One tie versus another is not a big deal. But when you have a higher stakes situation where emotions are high, where one decision over another can really make a significant impact, let's just say that you're buying a house and there's something about the house that you're about to buy that you just don't like. But then your spouse says, no, I love this house. This is absolutely everything I've ever wanted. So here now you're making a high stakes decision where emotions are clearly going to be running rampant. So this is where it does take time to cool off, spend a day or two, write down your notes. What are my motives? Do I want to keep the peace, and is that more important? Or do I want to please my spouse? And in order to do that, I'm willing to accept and sacrifice my personal taste or my personal, whatever that might be, in order to satisfy her needs. But then what are her motives, or what are his motives? Because if you don't understand those motives, then you both might be making a sacrifice over something that you thought the other person wanted when neither of you really did. Ouch. So that would be a really bad outcome. So keeping the peace tends to be the most common motive that people operate from. Another one, conflict avoidance. Very similar to keeping the peace, right? So in this case, you just don't want the conflict to take place. So you just push down your emotions, or you brush it under the rug, or anything like that. So conflict avoidance is also common. It's actually very common in the workplace. So if you have an opinion about how to move forward with a project or an idea, and that opinion runs counter to somebody who is more senior than you, then more often than not, you're going to keep your mouth shut. Why? Because there's also this idea of seniority and leadership. And if you are somebody that tends to be a people pleaser, and you tend to, seek ways to prevent, your supervisor or your leader from, being in a situation that creates discomfort for them, then you will never speak up. But that's a problem. That's a problem. That's why I would suggest go back to the second point about the dichotomy of choice. You don't have to choose. In other words, you can say the truth and maintain the relationship. Of course, it takes more skill and diplomacy, and it takes, more courage, which is ultimately why these are courageous conversations. Another one is looking good. So people lie all the time for the sake of looking good, or for not looking bad, right? If something happens and I don't want to take the fault for that, or I don't want to take the blame, then it's very common that I will approach the situation from my motive being looking good. And that is something that can really creep in and begin to erode our confidence and our character. So I would say this is one that you really want to watch out for. What is a good way to acknowledge this? Journaling. I try to journal almost every single day, and when I don't get around to journaling, I go for a walk, and I literally will talk to myself. And I'm trying to disclose my own thoughts so I can hear them. And when I can hear my thoughts, then I'm like, oh man, Antonio, this is the reason why you're thinking this way. It's because you want to look good, or because you want to avoid conflict. So I'm trying to discover my own motives. And remember, these motives lie hidden in our subconscious mind, so they're not always very easy to identify. Another motive might be winning or being right. So this one actually happens quite a bit in the workplace, especially people who are very driven, very motivated. They might be more than willing to sidestep the truth. They might be willing to sidestep another individual's opinions, their feelings, their emotions, everything, all in the name of winning. And well, clearly this one has a lot of room for improvement. Winning is a wonderful thing, obviously, but not when it comes at the expense of stepping over another person's freedom, over another person's rights, or another person's dignity. And that, by the way, is one of the components that I really speak of in my book. I lean into that because in my book, I talk a lot about sports because I love sports and the competitive aspect that comes with sports. And that's why it's such a good segue into business, because the competitive nature of sports will make its way into business. But although I mention competitive athletes from all around the world and from different disciplines, at the end of the day, the examples that I pick are of people who won while remaining virtuous and maintaining the dignity of their competitors or their coaches or their athletes or even the very fans that attend all these different events. So if you can keep the dignity of the other human being in mind, of the other person, of the rest, then you will naturally achieve respect and parity, which is the topic of one of my other videos. The other one, which is a harsh one, is punishing. Now, this happens a lot. Maybe not so much at work, although it does happen, but it definitely happens in a family setting, right? So think about, again, the last argument you might have had with your spouse. I guarantee you there was a moment in that argument where it was less about the truth. Maybe the truth didn't even matter anymore. This was about punishing the spouse. And it is a harsh word, no doubt, but punishment can come off any number of ways, right? Punishment could be something as simple as, like, if your spouse says, hey, can you help me with this or that? And you're like, no, I'm not going to do it because I'm upset at you. And that is sufficient motive to move out of a place where a courageous conversation would have taken place. So a great way to address this is, if you have some kind of resentment or disagreement, this is where you want to use this strategy of the dichotomy of choice. Remind yourself your spouse is your spouse. She is a person, or he is a person that you chose, that you love the most, that you want to work with, that you want to spend the rest of your life with, or that you just really want to give it all your energy if you're, like, let's just say in a dating environment, and you don't have any lifelong commitments. So even in those instances, you have to be able to separate, and I'm not a relationship expert, by the way, but if we use any of these principles in the relationship, then acknowledge that dichotomy. You don't necessarily have to choose between truth and that relationship, or truth and that friendship. In that moment, you can say, I love my spouse, and I also am hurt over X, Y, or Z. So then you just kind of bring those things to the table. In that moment, now you've identified your motive. So your motive was, I'm hurt and I wanted to punish you in a way, but not because I want to punish you, but rather I wanted you to see the degree to which X, Y, or Z hurt me. And that's why I'm leading with this, right? And maybe I might be stonewalling, or maybe you might be, well, anyway, there's a number of reasons why somebody might act a certain way. But if you identify the motive, the quicker you can identify the motive, the easier you're going to be able to resolve. And that is going to lead to a healthier relationship. So the question that you need to ask yourself is, what do I really want? If you begin with this question, then you're going to get to the resolution of the problem a whole lot quicker. So instead of just mulling over the argument or the topic of conversation or whatever happened in the relationship, whether it's professional or personal, you want to get to that question. What do I really want? I want to save face. I don't want to feel embarrassed. I don't want to embarrass him or her. I want to avoid a conflict because I'm emotionally exhausted and I just don't have the time or the space. I want this to go away. That's my motive. I don't want this to be a pressing matter anymore. I don't want to go. I do want to go. I'm concerned. Whatever that might be, get to the point. But then when you identify what that is for you, then the best thing you can do next is identify what that is for the other person. And that's where it takes a lot of work, because you really want to get into what do they want? What does she want, or what does he want out of this conversation, right? And then when you can identify that, And you might not necessarily need to ask the question, what do you want? But you can probably start to piece a few things out. And if you're really listening and leaning into that, which does take effort and it does take practice because it is a skill and it is a skill that you can build, then the quicker you can identify that, then you become much more of the leader within that conversation. And by the way, you can do this with your own leaders. In other words, you don't necessarily have to be on the receiving end of leadership, something that I talk a lot about in my book. You can lead a leader. In other words, you can lead somebody that is more senior in your organization by using these principles. And the best way to arrive at that is by asking questions. So you might ask, for instance, okay, I see what you're saying. Is this important to you for what reason? Or what is it that you're looking to gain in the next 3 months by making this decision? Or how can I help create an environment where you feel more empowered to make this decision? Whatever that might be. And I just kind of made a few of these up, but you get what I'm saying, right? You want to get not only to what you want, but you want to identify as quickly as possible what they want. They being, the other party, the other group, etc. So my last comment here is separate yourself from the content. So more often than not, when there is a disagreement, when there's a discussion, when there is even the potential for a fight, it's because these motives culturally are operating in the background. It might have nothing to do with the content. Remember, the content is the catalyst. Think about it that way. Content equals catalyst. Content equals catalyst. Really what's operating behind that is the motive. And that's what you want to get to. What is your motive? What do you want to get out of that? And if you resolve the motive, then you resolve the conversation. Guys, I hope you enjoyed that. Follow me for more videos like these. And please feel free to text me anytime on the comment or comment about any questions that you might have. I would love to get back to you on some of this. We'll see you at the next one. Take care.